So let's take a look at modeling the ball for our rig. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this cube by just clicking off, highlighting, and hit delete, and just remaking it so we can kind of start fresh. And I'm going to be repeating a lot of the movement controls and so forth just for the people who've never really used Maya. So I'm going to go up to the top here, go to Create. I'm going to go to Polygon Primitive. I'm going to click on Cube. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to hit Spacebar, and I'm going to just look at this. I'm scrolling the wheel in and out here to zoom, and just pulling it above that line in my front view and then in my side view. And I really want this to be, this axis controller to be centered on this line, this dark black line. This is our center point. And one way of doing that is, for example, say you kind of have it off kilter, right? So for some reason it's like all the way over here or something, right? And you're like, oh my God, how do I do this? This is a little nerve-wracking. So in my top view, if I hold the X key down and I click on it, you can see it snaps it to the grid. So that kind of moved it there. Another thing I want to do is move this to the very bottom of my cube so that whenever I move it in that respect, like I go to snap it, I always have it there. So I'm going to hit the D as in duck key. And you'll notice I now get this movement controller that shows my movement, my rotation, and my scales all together. And the reason for that is because I can actually rotate this to give me different axis controls, and which we would do later in other tutorials. But for now, with this selected this way, I'm going to go ahead and hold X down again, and you'll see that that is selected because it gave me this circle, which indicates that now I can snap my axis controller around. And I'm just going to snap that to the bottom of my grid here. So you can see here, it's there. And I'm going to hit D as in duck again. So now I have it placed, so whenever I want to re-snap it to the bottom of that grid, I can hold X and just snap it to whatever grid point that I want. Okay? And as I'm rotating by holding Alt and left, I'm going to go back in here, and I'm going to start to model my sphere. So really all I want to do here, and a lot of people are like, well, why not just use the Create Polygon Primitive Sphere? The reason for that is I come from the games and animation, commercial animation world where you have to create things fairly quickly. In the film industry as well, you want to keep things as quadded out as possible. And what you'll notice with this sphere here is at the top, it triangulates, which could be fine if you're for other tasks, or say you're creating an eyeball or whatever, but not something that's animating. It gives you a weird sort of deformation. When I go to sort of animate this out, like move this, you'll see it gets kind of, it doesn't give me as nice of deformation. You can see these are not even. They start to stretch out and then they squeeze at the top. So I'm going to go to object mode again and just delete that. So how do we create a quadded out sphere? Well, it's simple. We create a cube, and then you can see up in these different options, we have our mesh option here, and we just go down to smooth. And you'll see that it created a quad, which means a 4-edged face. And I'm just going to go 2 on that. And I'm going to right click and go to object mode. And now we have essentially a sphere that consists or created of all 4-sided faces. Okay. Now that's like a very rudimentary beginning process of phase 1, which is modeling. So whenever you create anything, a character, an environment, or whatever, step 1 is to model it. Step 2 is a process called UVing. So under the modeling panel here, you'll see that there's a top option here called UV. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to open my UV editor. What a UV is a 2D representation of our sphere. So let's imagine for a second that before we construct our sphere, we want to draw on it. Well, it's much easier for us to cut this up and lay it flat and draw on it. So let me go ahead and pause this video. I'm going to show you a couple examples of UVs for models. So here's a great example of some UVs. So for example, on this character, we have all of the skin element on one UV set. And you can see here that they look like this Silence of the Lamb, like you de-skinned a person. And then they painted on it, like you can see the muscles and things like that. And then they have the cloth on a separate, the individual elements like the belt, and I guess this armor, if it's armor, on its own thing, all the leather elements. So fabric, leather, and skin. And this will go into texturing, which is the next process. So you can see these are flat, 2-dimensional versions of the 3D model, and that's painted on, right? And then here's fur. And this is actually a pretty good process because you want to create something which is called physically based material. So that's all of the textures are, they match, or all the textures that are of a similar type on one map. It's not really optimized for mobile this way, but that's a whole nother discussion. So what we're going to do is create a very simple process of unwrapping the sphere, okay? And what we want to do is we're going to unwrap the sphere like we would a map or the way you would do a head, so any spherical object. So the first thing I do is I right-click on my mouse and I don't release it on the model, and you'll see I'll get these options. I'm going to go to face mode. Now, if it doesn't automatically select it, so you just end up with something that looks like this, just double-click your left mouse button twice, and that'll select the whole mesh. I'm going to hit F to focus, just so you can see this. I'm holding Alt to rotate. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something called planar mapping. And what that does is from a specific axis, it just takes a snapshot, or it flattens it out. So there's a couple ways of doing this. The fastest way is if I hold the Shift key down and I right-click, and I go down to mapping. And mind you, I'm not releasing my mouse here, and I'm going to map it on Z. Now mind you, Z is the front, so you can see now we have a 2D representation or a flat representation of that front view. Now I'm going to click off. I'm going to right-click and go to Edge mode. And what I'm going to do is create something called a seam. So what you can do is on the center seam here, I'm going to double-click it. And now you can see it wrapped the center brown edge all the way around the middle. And what I really want to do here is I want to only select half of this. See this edge that goes all the way around here? So what I'm going to do is just kind of hit spacebar, and on my side view here, I'm going to scroll in, I'm going to hold the Control key, and I'm going to deselect that area. So now you can see, if I press 5 up here, I'm going to hit spacebar, the edge is only around that center. See that it's halfway through the model. And then what I can do up here is I can go to Cut So, and I can hit Cut. Notice the hotkey, which I'll use often, is Shift X, and it made a large brown line. And now when I click off, it becomes white, and that's showing me where the seam is of my model. Okay, so let's right-click, go to UV mode, double-click our model here, go to Unfold, and hit Unfold. And you can see it stretched it out, and it made a 2D flat version of this model based on that. Okay, so what we want to do, though, when we're painting this or creating this, is we want to fit it inside of this box. So for now, I'm just going to hit R, scale this down. Then I'm going to hit E. Notice it corresponds with these guys over here. Here's R, here's E. I'm going to rotate it. And it doesn't necessarily matter the placement, right? I just want to give it a pretty good chunk. And then I'm going to right-click, go to Object Mode again. I'm going to close this. So now that's unwrapped. The last step of our process is we want to add a picture or texture to this. Now we're not going to hand paint it. We're going to use something that's default from Maya. So I'm going to right-click here. I'm holding down the right mouse button on this guy right here, right? Make sure you're in Object Mode. Notice I right-click and went to Object Mode. Right-click, do not release the mouse. Go down to Assign New Material. I'm going to go to Lambert. And if it clicks off here and you don't see what's going on, I'm going to right-click again on the sphere and go to Material Attributes. And under the Color panel here, I'm going to click this checkerboard, and I'm going to select Checker. Now, if you don't see anything in your view like me, you just hit 6, and you should be able to see the checkerboard on your model. Now, what's interesting is, well, how does this UVs connect to that checkerboard pattern? Well, based on the size of these UVs, see how I can scale this up and I can scale this down? It gives me a little bit more of a control over the size of the texture, right? So the way I did that is I double-clicked it. I'm in UV mode, and I have R on, or scale, and I can scale it up and down. So feel free to scale it any way you like. All right, so I'm going to go back to Object Mode. Looks pretty good. Make sure to go to File, save your scene. So what we'll do in the next video is start setting up our rig so we can get to animate.